Good day. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on community living housing options for people with IDDD, perspectives on barriers and solutions. Before I go any further, I wanted to let you know that we have an ASL interpreter and CART services available for today's webinar. We are recording today's webinar, so all attendees will be in listen-only mode. Please do not unmute so that we can limit any background noise. We thank you for that in advance. I am Jennifer Johnson, and I am the Deputy Commissioner of the Administration on Disabilities in the Administration for Community Living, or ACL. I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length gray hair that is curly. I have on a gray sweater and reading glasses. I have a virtual background, which is blue and has the ACL logo. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Administration for Community Living, or like I said, ACL for short, we are part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. We fund disability and aging organizations that help people with disabilities and older adults live, work, and participate in their communities, and also prevent them from going into institutions. We work with partners across the federal government, including the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, advocating for quality community living for people with disabilities and older adults. We are proud to bring you this webinar through the Housing and Services Resource Center, or HSRC, which is a partnership between HHS and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD for short. In every state and community, there are a number of entities and programs helping people access housing and supportive services. However, the housing and service systems are often siloed. Partnerships and stronger collaboration between these systems would enable more people with disabilities and older adults and people experiencing homelessness to achieve housing stability, live with dignity and independence in the community, and avoid homelessness and costly institutional care. The HSRC leverages our collective technical assistance across the federal agencies to cultivate cross-sector partnerships that bring together housing, homelessness services, aging and disability services, and health services, including physical, behavioral, and mental health services. The HSRC website is a one-stop shop to access federal technical assistance resources on housing and community services. Today, as we close out DD Awareness Month, celebrating the full inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in our communities, we are launching a three-part webinar series on housing for people with IDDD to bring attention to how the various barriers they face to living independently in the community has led to very limited housing options, and that we collectively all have a responsibility to change that. Through DD Awareness Month, we have been celebrating decades of progress for people with IDDD. Yet despite that progress, many barriers still exist for people with IDDD to be fully included as valued members in all aspects of community life. In most cases, those barriers are caused by biases and societal beliefs that have created low expectations about what people with IDDD can do and achieve. These beliefs have had devastating results. People with IDDD experience higher rates of poverty and homelessness, lower rates of employment and educational attainment, and poorer health outcomes. But we know here at ACL, and many of you online with us today, know that people with IDDD can work, they can live in the community, they can graduate from high school and beyond, and you're going to hear about that today. Safe, affordable housing is a necessity for everyone. Without a decent place to live, people cannot thrive. There is a growing awareness and understanding that health is linked not only to the physical structure of a housing unit, the physical building in which somebody is housed, but also to the neighborhood and community in which the house is located. Safe, affordable, and accessible housing is a human right. To be adequately housed means having a secure place to live. not having to worry about being evicted or having your home taken away. It means living somewhere that is in keeping with your culture and having access to services, schools, and employment. Yet housing is rarely treated as a human right. In today's world, it is treated as a commodity. We have witnessed housing markets worldwide transform so that housing has become a vehicle for wealth and investment rather than a social good. The changing housing market has increasingly made housing unaffordable. When you're a person with an intellectual or developmental disability, you face even more obstacles to housing. Add to that an intersectional lens, the challenges are even greater. People with IDDD end up with very few options for living in the community, the most common being living in your family's home or living in a group home. But what these living options do is oftentimes create other forms of segregation, where people with IDDD face spatial segregation that excludes them from equal access to public services, education, transportation, and other opportunities. Local governments are often at the forefront of the struggle for housing and can play a key role in protecting and realizing the right to safe, affordable, and accessible housing. Today, we have a great lineup of speakers who are going to introduce you to housing issues for people with IDDD. Our subsequent webinars in our three-part series will focus on innovative strategies and share information on resources, partners, and funding streams to help create better housing opportunities for people with IDDD. Today's PowerPoint and the recording will be available on the HSRC website, and we will post links to the housing resources housing resources in the chat throughout the webinar. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, please type your questions into the chat box. I now want to introduce you to our first speaker, Teresa Moore. Teresa has been a self-advocacy leader for more than 10 years. She is a member of the board of directors for Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered. She works on many projects lifting up the voice of people with IDDD and is an expert on many topics, including how to develop and create accessible materials. You're going to hear her housing story. So Teresa, thank you for being here with us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. Excuse me. So I'm going to talk about some of the housing messages that we have and the barriers. But I want to tell you the organization Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered and their Self-Advocacy Resource and Technical Assistance Center are doing a lot of work in the housing arena, and we collect stories, and I'll talk to you more about that. I am the director of the SARTEC project. I'm going to talk about the self-advocacy path to a dream. And next slide, please. So some of the messages and suggestions that people get about living in and their future come from what they hear and what they see and what's going on in their life. And people with IDD, like was said, what mostly end up living in their family home with family members all of their life, and life in a smaller institution, what we call group homes, with lots of rules and staff who have a lot of control over what happens to them and their day in and day out activities. So a few figured out how to live in the community. I'm going to talk about that. And some are supported in their own apartment, and some are supported in apartments with roommates. So next slide, please. So housing is a life in transition. Housing for people with disabilities usually comes with many stories when you talk about people's journey in and out of apartments and different things that happen to them. But one of the things that we start with is our cultural connection to messages that have not changed a lot yet for people with disabilities. Some families expect family members who need support to live with them their whole life. Some families start out talking with their children about moving out when they talk about going to college. That's what happened for my brothers and sisters. They got that conversation almost from childhood. And they talked about how when they would have their own life, they would move out on their own. And some cultures believe that a person lives at home until they get married and they begin their own family. So those are some of the cultural messages that people get. And people with disabilities are hearing these things and expecting that that's their story too. Next slide, please. But that doesn't always happen. So for me, my housing journey started about in my 20s. After I went to college, I thought, just like my brothers and sisters, I'd get the chance to go out and live in my own place and build my own future. And that wasn't what the messages were that I was getting from the service system. The service system would say things like thinking about living at home with your parents, maybe, so mom can take care of you for the rest of your life. And that didn't sound good to me. And then, or you could live in a nice group home, and you would have roommates that live with you and other people you might like. And then you wouldn't have to worry about being alone if you lived in a group home. Still didn't sound like something I wanted. I was still flashing back to when my brothers and sisters had that chance to dream or to have goals about, transitioning throughout life and having their own place or maybe even a home someday. And most of the time, what we ended up doing was talking about budgets and accessibility when we talked about housing, and dreams were really not talked about very much. What did you want or any of that? It was worried about how are we going to get the money to do it and how accessible was it going to be. Next slide, please. And so I started asking some questions about services and supports for housing, like Section 8, and they would help me find an apartment. That's what I was told. But I was also told, that I shouldn't be thinking about bringing my dogs with me, because if maybe they might take one dog, but I had 3 dogs because I like to take in animals that had disabilities too, like I did, and give them a loving home. But I shouldn't be thinking about that idea anymore if I wanted to live in Section 8. And this was usually the place that was most accessible. They would have Section 8 housing that was accessible, and they helped you with some of the income questions. So I went on a tour of what was one of the accessible communities built for people with disabilities. And when we drove into the complex, it was really nice. And I thought, this is great. But then we kept driving. And it turns out that the apartments for people with disabilities were in the back of this beautiful complex. And as we got deeper into the complex, it was less and less pretty. And it looked like it was very impoverished area where things were not being taken care of as well. Landscaping was a little messier and things. So I thought, that's odd or strange to me. But okay, so let's go on a tour of the apartment. Well, I was fortunate enough that they were all full. So some people volunteered to show me where they lived in their apartment. And I went in, and immediately all I could do was smell the smell of urine. And thought, oh my goodness, well, maybe they just haven't cleaned in a while and that'll go away. And then I noticed also that they didn't seem to have enough help because things were really piled up. Their accessible equipment was pushed away and out of the way, and it looked like it would be hard to get to sometimes. And It looked like people were really struggling to keep up with things on their own. And that really concerned me because I'm a very neat, organized person. So I wondered if it would be enough space for me to have the equipment that I needed and the accessibility that I needed, along with the stuff that I would need to bring with me to accommodate my disability. So when they described this apartment to me, they said, this is one of our most upscaled places for people with disabilities to live in town. You're very lucky to be even considered for this list. And I said, how long is the list? Well, it's over a year, but we think, if somebody moves out or if somebody passes away, maybe the list will move and there'll be a chance for you to get in. I thought, oh, that's horrible way to think about things. Next slide, please. So I wondered, what about the idea of a house? Because when I lived, I did practice in between. I didn't go to that place, but I did try traditional community settings where they said the apartment was larger and more accessible. But every time I would go into the bathroom with my wheelchair in one of my apartments, if I didn't do it just right, at the right angle, I would get stuck in the bathroom with my wheelchair. And it sometimes was several hours before I could get myself out. And if I was lucky enough to have remembered to take my phone into the bathroom with me, I might be able to call for help. So that was always scary for me, that my apartment was too small. And there was actually one room that I couldn't actually go into because the doorway was too small. So that was just a place to store things. And I really couldn't go back in and get them. So at the time, I was talking to friends about this issue, and one of my friends said, well, what if we buy a house? And I said, oh, maybe that's an idea. We both had part-time jobs in SSDI, the Social Security Disability Insurance that comes in. And so we thought, well, that'd be great. We could try that. And I mentioned it to my support coordinator that I really, really wanted to buy a house, that I thought I had too much stuff to fit into small rooms that the apartment had. And I can't really access everything anyway. And I'm tired of getting stuck in different places where I can't reach things or couldn't use all of the storage. And so I mentioned to her, I'd really like to move. And if it was within a few weeks, she called me back and she said, you won't believe this, but a family is moving out of a semi-accessible home and they love your story and they are willing for you to go and look at it and see if it would work for you. So we set up the tour. The house was semi-accessible, just like she said. It needed some ramps. I could barely fit in the front door and I scraped my hand when I was trying to get in, and that was kind of nervous. Didn't want to tear up the house. And we had to put down portable ramps for me to get through the house in some of the areas where there was a step. And so, but my family and I talked about it and they said they would help me keep things up if I did buy the house. And we decided to go for it. So the family, hearing my story, decided not to even have other people apply. They wanted to give another person with a disability, because their daughter had a disability. They wanted to give someone a chance to have this home that had an accessible bathroom, a chance to develop it and use it. So my friend and I moved in and we contacted the independent living centers and some other centers that did accessibility features, adaptations to the home. And we had them adapt the entrances to the home so that there would not be a step in on the front door. They put a sidewalk that was leveled to the entrance so that we could get in the front door and also exit a side door that could be made easily accessible by just widening the door. And they helped make our kitchen accessible. Next slide, please. So 22 years later, my roommate decided that living in a house wasn't her thing and she didn't like all the bills, but I am been very happy and I now live in the same house with my fiance. And there have been some troubles finding supports. And especially during this last bit of time when the pandemic has been going on, we know that there's a staffing crisis going on across our country. And during the pandemic, it was suggested that my fiance, who also has a disability, and I split up and move into group homes because that would allow us to have enough staff. And recently, we said no to that idea of splitting up. And recently, it was suggested to me by my support coordinator that I turn my home into a group home. And I immediately said, no, that's not an option that I would go for. And we're still having difficulty having enough staff, but I don't want to give up my house. So that was a threat to our independence. Next slide, please. So that was my story, and it continues to be an issue of having enough staff, but we are hanging on to our home, working very hard to keep it. But we'll still struggle to find those staff that will make our home and our life work. But there's other people that I've been hearing from across the country. These stories are from Alabama and North Dakota. Housing is limited and being taken away from people with disabilities. Recently, I was told a story of someone who needed to go into the hospital. And while they were in the hospital, they were told that if they were in the hospital within another few days, they would lose their apartment and it would be given away to someone else, and that they would not have an apartment to return to. And another friend told me a story about a person who had a short hospital stay, but went into rehab. And while they were in rehab, they were told that they would lose their apartment because they were in there too long, and that they would have to go to a nursing home instead of being able to go home because they would need a little bit more time to recover. And it has become more and more obvious that the options that are being offered to people are, while you are recovering in the hospital or in rehab, that people with disabilities across the country are losing their settings that they're in the community because while they're there, the provider agencies are considering just moving them out permanently and not allowing them to return home and not offering them services anymore. And the threat is that we are losing more and more young people to the nursing home system because they lose their setting while they're in recovery. And this to me is very, very sad that we have to fight for this. And for one of these participants in North Dakota, they were part of their self-advocacy organization, and a different provider that they received other services from found out their story and advocated for them to not lose their apartment and to maintain that setting. And they helped that person be able to return home, but it was not without a fight. And isn't it a horrible thing to think that if you do not have an advocate or you're not connected in some way or don't have somebody that's going to speak up and help you out in the community, that you're going to have a hard time returning to your home after your recovery or being in rehab? That's just frightening. And that you sometimes will find people in nursing homes who have similar stories like this. Next slide, please. So how can we support future self-advocates to not go through this? Well, one of the things that I constantly do is make sure that keeping my house is in my support plan, and I encourage others to do that. And the home and community-based services encourages people to make sure that what they plan for their future is written in their plan around housing and other things that are vitally important to them, that they always work towards checking in and making sure this stays in your plan and is an active part of the conversation that you have while you're still at home. If you're receiving services as a young person, that you keep putting this in your plan. And how can we talk about this? Well, we need to make sure that you tell as many people as you can about what your dreams and goals are around housing, whether it's living in an apartment or having roommates or having your own house someday. You have to tell a lot of people sometimes to make the memory so that they can support you and make sure that they're checking in to make sure that dream is coming true for you. And we need to support families to have this discussion that is not limited to what the system usually offers and expects people to respond to it in some kind of positive way. That, having funded housing or having group homes as the only option that we're talking about, and being creative with how those different funds can be used. And that we offer a system of support, not one that expects the same from us or itself in the future, by supporting the home and community-based services that people have and talking about this openly and honestly about what anyone would want for their future, because it can happen to anybody at any time, that you might need to have support, whether you're aging or whether you have a disability. These things can change so quickly if you don't have a plan in place. And to believe in the power of connection between self-advocates. If people were not connected to community members who were checking on them and care about them, they might have ended up isolated in a nursing home where nobody knows where they're at even. Sometimes they move you while you're sick and you don't even know until you wake up and you're in a different location, or you've been medicated and you don't know where they're taking you. And the power between self-advocates and other advocacy organizations, that they're well connected, that they have people to talk to about what's happening to them, that they have the numbers, and that they know what the names are of people who can help them, and should just want this for all of us, for everyone to have the place where they dream of living, they dream of being, and what community it is, not far away from the people they love, but somewhere close by where they know they're supported and they have people that believe in them. Next slide, please. So SABE, Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, and the SARTEC project are doing community, home and community-based services rules training, because self-advocacy, because of the pandemic, has been a little bit slow in returning. We have this wonderful grant with HSRI, Human Resource Institute, and ACL to work on educating people about what their rights are in housing and services that they can ask for and talk about with people that they love and care about. And we also have another grant with Harvard to talk about the personal stories of having home and community-based services and what that life has offered them and how it has helped them, and any other barriers that they've been come across or encountered. And we would love to hear from self-advocates about what your story is. Next slide, please. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Teresa, very much for sharing your story with us. You're an amazing advocate for yourself and for others. And your story really shed light on the challenges in finding safe, affordable, and accessible housing, and really personalize the challenge that not only you face, but also others living with disabilities face. But it also is because of your advocacy that you were able to get housing. So congratulations on that. And I hope your advocacy continues to keep you where you are. And through that, you really shed light on how fragile housing can be and how unsettling the threats to housing stability can be as well. So again, thank you. I want to introduce you to our next speaker, Mary Sowers. Mary is the Executive Director of the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services. Mary has been a consultant to state governments and has held senior positions with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. She is an expert in Medicaid home and community-based services, managed long-term services and supports, self-directions, and strategies to design person-centered systems of care. Mary has also served as a direct support professional. She's going to offer insights on policy and system issues that create barriers for people with IDDD. Mary, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and a special thanks to Teresa for really setting the stage for the conversation today. I think you'll see as I describe how states are trying to address the persistent issues with finding affordable, accessible housing, that Teresa's stories and the stories that she brought forth from others really highlighted the challenges that exist across our nation. Next slide, please. Just briefly, as Jennifer said, I am with the National Association of State DD Directors, and so that means we represent each of the states' systems that support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the country. But even within that structure, there's a lot of variation from state to state. And so depending on the state in which you live, the IDD system may serve different ages of individuals, may serve slightly different populations of individuals, may offer services in different ways. All states offer robust home and community-based services, but there are still some states that utilize institutional benefits. And certainly we're seeing more and more states manage state plan benefits and offering home and community-based options through tools other than waiver programs. And then, of course, there are the service delivery systems and partners in the way that services are delivered. And so while with some states really supporting more individuals in their own home or family home, and you'll hear from my colleague, Sherry Larson, later today on the statistics behind that. And then we've got other states that lean more on provider-owned and operated settings, such as group homes that you heard Teresa discuss earlier. Next slide, please. The trends and patterns in service offerings, I think, can shed a little bit of light of where states are struggling to address the issues of housing. And I should start the conversation by saying that Medicaid home and community-based services, as many of you know, does not allow for the provision of room and board. And so states have to think of different strategies to ensure that individuals have places to live while they're also living in the community. And this can be a challenge. And you heard Jennifer talk about the increasing costs of housing across the country and how that can also put people really out of reach of housing options. But states are really trying to increase opportunities for individual choice and autonomy in the services that they receive. But they're also trying to grow a continuum of options that enable individuals to have supports they need to live and thrive in the community, but not always have to have those coupled with housing and services. And so we're also seeing states increase opportunities for self-direction in that vein as well. And of course, states are spending a lot of time right now trying to build the infrastructure to embody the spirit of the home and community-based services regulation, particularly those provisions that talk about the opportunities for individuals to receive services in community-based settings that afford them all of the civil rights and privacy and autonomy and choice that the rest of the community has available to them. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle as we're thinking about what housing options are truly available for individuals. Next slide, please. Of course, the challenges that we hear from our members are not different than what you've already heard today. There's a problem with just the availability of housing, the affordability of housing, and certainly the accessibility of housing. And while there may be some differences, these issues exist across urban, rural, suburban, and frontier areas in the United States. And this is even more so for individuals who rely on supplemental security income, or SSI, because that really has a limited amount of resources that is available to individuals, making many housing markets in the United States out of reach with really limited options available. We still know too that biases persist in rental practices. And so we know that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and other disabilities face biases and perceptions of their ability to live in the community. And coupled with other intersectionalities, we know people have very difficult time obtaining housing in communities in which they want to live. And then, of course, we also heard from Teresa that the availability of supports is an important component as individuals are maintaining their housing. And the direct support crisis is really causing a challenge for individuals that are living independently, but do need the supports to make their day-to-day activities feasible. Next slide, please. So what are states doing to address the housing issues? There's a lot of work to do. And I think that every state that you talk to, state IDD agency, is wrestling with ideas to make bigger strides in making affordable, accessible housing a reality for more individuals that they support. But we are beginning to see state IDD agencies forging partnerships with state and local public housing agencies to make sure that individuals with IDD can access resources such as housing vouchers. And in addition to sort of, building the relationships so that individuals can access those resources, this really is an important step to build relationships across the different service systems. And there's often a lot of misunderstanding across service systems about the ability for individuals to live and thrive in their communities and really make contributions there. We also know that sometimes where the public housing authorities may make investments might not align with where the state wants to go in terms of ensuring that individuals have meaningful choice of integrated, accessible housing throughout the community. And so these partnerships really provide an opportunity for education and continued working together to make sure that all of the state agencies are on the same page with regard to where the investments for housing should be made. Importantly, and this is a really exciting new development, but state IDD agencies are working with their Medicaid agencies to increase the opportunities that are being made available through the Money Follows the Person demonstration program. And while there are still states that may not participate in that, the recent MFP policy developments are very promising around the housing issues. And I won't go into great detail, it can get a little bit wonky, but we're very thrilled that CMS has announced that supplemental services are available to states to provide up to 6 months of housing to help individuals secure housing and really get settled. And these policies create great opportunities to get over the barrier of helping individuals return to the community and reestablish their ties. This is especially important for the circumstances you heard Teresa discuss, when individuals might go into a hospital or an institution for a short period of time and be at risk of losing their housing. So these services can be extraordinarily important there. We're also seeing states add the opportunity for some room and board using state-only dollars to help individuals to maintain community-based housing or to obtain it. Those are few and far between just because of the resources necessary, but I think more and more states are looking into the possibilities there. Next slide, please. We also know that several state agencies are working with organizations whose sole purpose is aimed at increasing the availability of affordable integrated housing, not attached to services. And there are efforts being made to work with developers and other funders to try to increase the availability of these resources. These organizations are also providing information to families, and they often provide navigation assistance. Just two examples, and there are more increasing across the country, but the Missouri Inclusive Housing and Maryland Inclusive Housing organizations have been great partners with the states as they've been trying to make some inroads at increasing the availability of housing that's not tied to services specifically. And then we're also seeing state agencies add permissible services to their HCBS waiver programs. These might be tenancy and pre-tenancy supports to really help individuals sort of understand the roles and responsibilities of being a tenant, and also providing tips and assistance to ensure success in those living environments. So we're hopeful that more states will continue to look at these as really important services to help individuals both return or enter the housing market, but importantly to retain their housing over time. And we're also seeing states really thinking about the role that technology might play in supporting individuals to live more independently, of course, balancing autonomy, choice, and privacy, but really trying to leverage the technology of today to help individuals thrive in their communities, especially at a time when perhaps traditional ways of providing support might be more and more difficult to obtain. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, there's just a lot of work to do in order to make sure that individuals with IDD have the same choices that everyone else does to live in communities of their choosing. We really know that it's that other areas of the service system are critical for ensuring options for community living, both related to workforce, but also in terms of partnerships or cross state agencies, to ensure that there's a real focus on expanding access to affordable, accessible, integrated housing for individuals. And we really need to make sure that individuals, while they may choose to live in a setting that is also tied to the entity that provides their housing, that's not the only way for an individual to live in the community, and that there's really a continuum of options available for individuals along the way. So I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to talk with you today, encouraged by a lot of the activity that's being focused on housing at the moment, but recognizing we've got a long road ahead, and very grateful for the partnership that and leadership that ACL and HUD have shown through this resource center. So many thanks.
Thank you, Mary. You really provided a very clear overview of housing issues in the U.S. That are really making it difficult for people with IDD to get and maintain housing, and also offered a little bit of insights into the innovative ways states are trying to create more community living options for people with IDD. I think heard from you that not only is the advocacy important, as Teresa discussed, but also states working on solutions is critical to creating more housing solutions or options for people with IDD. I'd like to now introduce you to our last speaker, Dr. Cheryl Larson, or Sherry. Sherry is a principal investigator and research manager at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration, where she has worked since 1988. Sherry directs the National Residential Information Systems Project, which is a 35-year longitudinal study of living arrangements for people with IDD. She has led dozens of grant-funded projects on topics such as Medicaid, long-term services and supports, direct support professionals, and has published hundreds of articles, books, and technical reports and other products. She's going to talk today about data that really provides a picture on housing for people with IDD and also where they are living. So Sherry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this great panel today. I've learned so much from the other speakers and would love to continue to have dialogue with both of them on this topic. So the Residential Information System project is one of 3 ACL-funded longitudinal data projects of national significance. Our focus is on describing the prevalence and characteristics of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are served by state IDD agencies. We describe the places people with IDD live and how those where they have lived has changed over time. We also provide annual updates on the number of people with IDD waiting for Medicaid HCBS waiver funded supports. Next slide, please. Our products are jointly funded by ACL through the Projects of National Significance, as well as through the National Institutes on Disability and Independent Living Rehabilitation Research. One of their programs is the Research and Training Centers, and we have one of those in Minnesota called the Research and Training Center on Community Living for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Next slide, please. So to frame our my discussion today, I just want to share with you kind of a picture of who people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are in terms of how many people we're talking about. We estimate that there's about 7.39 million people in the United States who have intellectual or developmental disabilities. That is that's broken down into 5.26 million people who are birth to 21 years old and 2.13 million people who are ages 22 and older. And the reason that the number is so much higher for birth to 21 is because the definition of disability for children is often more generous than it is for adults. For people who are adults, in order for them to be able to receive services, they must have support needs in 3 or more areas that are persistent and last a lifetime. We know that about 1.4 million people with IDD get services through state IDD agencies. We know that about 46% of all adults in the United States who have intellectual or developmental disabilities are supported by state IDD systems, and about 12% of children are supported by IDD agencies. That doesn't mean that children are not supported. It means that they're supported by other agencies like the Department of Education and other entities within the state while they are children. Next slide, please. So I have several messages that I want to share. One of the main messages that I want to share is that the access to services varies tremendously across states. And Mary talked about some of the reasons why states are different in terms of how much services they offer. But what we see here is huge differences in the number of adults with IDD per 100,000 of the state population who are getting services either in Medicaid's intermediate care facilities institutional program or through one of Medicaid's home and community-based programs, the home and community-based waiver funded supports. The national average is there's 316 adults per 100,000 who are getting supports through state IDD agencies while living in an ICF or getting home and community-based services. But the range is from 99 people per 100,000 to 770 people per 100,000 in Wisconsin. So adults in some states are 7 times more likely to be able to get Medicaid funded supports in these particular categories than in other states. Now, there's a lot of reasons for these differences. A primary one is that some states have shifted away from using Medicaid waiver home and community-based services to using Medicaid state plan home and community-based services funding. And we are not showing the home and community, the state plan funding on this particular slide. Next slide, please. So my second main message is most people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live with family members throughout their lives. And so from our research a few decades ago, we know that about 85% of people of all ages who have IDD are living with family members. In 2019, there were about 849,000 LTSS recipients who lived with family members. That was about 60% of all of the people who got long-term supports and services. But there were people who lived in other settings, including 11% who lived in their own home, 5% who lived in a host or foster family setting, 16% who lived in group settings in which 6 or fewer service recipients shared the home, and 8% of people live in group homes or institutions in which 7 or more service recipients live. Next slide, please. Amongst the adults who are not living with family members, because very few children live in settings other than with their family members. So amongst adults, we've got about 527,000 people in the United States with intellectual and developmental disabilities living in settings other than with their family members. So in 2019, 83% of those people lived in small places, settings of 6 or fewer service recipients. 10% lived in settings of 7 to 15 people, and 6% lived in settings of 16 or more people. Next slide, please. So since we're talking about diversity and opportunities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to live in individualized settings, I thought I would show a picture of the 3 categories that we track of services that are that allow the most individualization of services. That is group homes shared by where the provider owns and operates the housing, and 1 to 3 people who are service recipients live there. The second one is a home that's owned or rented by a host or a foster family who decides who lives in that home. And then the final category is people's own home, where the person with a disability, him or herself, makes decisions about who lives in the home, and they can decide if they don't like the provider that they currently have and they need or they want another provider, they can choose another provider without having to leave their home. So we know from our research that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who share a home with 3 or fewer service recipients have more choices about what to do. And when they do things, they're more satisfied with their services and they participate in more inclusive community activities. The number of people living in individualized settings altogether, so that's the height of each of the bars total, increased from 125,000 or 126,000 in 1998 to 300,000 in 2019. So that more than doubled the number of people who are living in these smallest settings. The biggest growth was amongst people with IDD living in a home of their own. That category, which is the lightest bar in the top of the top section of the bars, grew from 63,000 people in 1998 to 153,000 people in 2019, which is a very significant improvement in opportunities for people to live in their own homes. Next slide, please. So I thought I would also share just a little bit about where we're at in terms of providing long-term supports and services in institutional settings. I have another slide that shows the decrease in the number of people living in state-operated institutions going back to 1967. In 1967, 194,000 people with intellectual or developmental disabilities lived in state-run institutions. By 1999, the number of people in those places had declined to 49,150, and today it's down to 16,200 people. That's the light bars at the top. The total number of people living in facilities of 16 or more people declined from 109,000 to 60,000. The people who, in addition to the people who lived in state-operated IDD settings, there were people who lived in settings that were not operated by a state agency. They were contracted by the state or to provide services privately. There, in 1999, there were 33,000 people with IDD living in those places, and by 2019, that had declined to 18,000 people. And then the final category where we have large numbers of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is that setting that was talked about earlier today, and that is nursing homes or psychiatric facilities. The number of people in those settings has not changed over the last 2 decades substantially. It was 26,500 in 1999 and 26,019 in 2019. Now, I saw some statistics yesterday from my colleague Shay Tanis, who was looking at nursing homes after COVID, and the number of, it looks like from her data, from her analysis, that the number of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in nursing homes declined pretty substantially during the COVID years. And there's a lot of work to do to figure out exactly what was happening there. Was it because people moved home with family, or was it because people died due to COVID? We don't know the answer to that yet today. So in terms of large institutions, which people might have in their head as kind of the place that people live, it's not really true anymore. 17 states in the District of Columbia have closed all of their state-run IDD facilities. At the current rate of decline, it is very likely that the number of states without large state-operated IDD facilities will grow significantly, even in the next 7 years before 2030. All right, so next slide, please. So I had a couple of other thoughts that I don't have slides for and that I wanted to mention to you. One of them is in Minnesota, there was a lawsuit that was a federal class action lawsuit, Murphy versus Harpstead, that was settled in 2022. The argument in the lawsuit was that many Minnesotans with intellectual and developmental disabilities living in group homes wanted to move and had requested assistance with moving, but had not gotten adequate supports to make a move possible. One of the members of the legal team observed that our clients were denied the opportunity to make decisions on how and where they wanted to live and experienced unnecessary segregation in group homes. For example, the individuals could not pick their roommates, select the staff assisting them, or choose their daily set schedules. As I said, this lawsuit was settled out of court in 2022. As a result of the settlement, Department of Human Services in Minnesota will identify Minnesotans living in group homes who want to move to more individualized housing, and they will provide those individuals with information about options and ensure that their case managers provide supports. They will require case managers to take housing-related training and allow anyone who wants to appeal a denial of housing stabilization services to know how to do so. They will also create a system to measure whether the efforts to move people from group homes, and in Minnesota, most group homes have 4 to 6 people, so these are not large places, but there are still a good number of people in those settings who would like to live elsewhere. The Minnesota Department of Human Services will be creating a system to measure whether efforts to help people move into new housing situations are successful. As a result of the settlement, there was also a good amount of money in attorney's fees that were paid to Minnesota's Protection and Advocacy Organization to help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are experiencing difficulties in getting their own getting housing to be able to do that. And then finally, I want to note that the University of Minnesota had this fall a conference on the intersection of cultural identities and community housing, and we identified a number of questions that researchers need to look at in this area. One of those questions is, in terms of housing and long-term supports, needs, and outcomes, what are the disparities in access, accessibility, acceptability, quality, and utilization? What are the impact on housing and LTSS needs and outcomes of household factors such as poverty, household composition, and living with a family member, and also the impact of neighborhood characteristics such as walkability in Minnesota, whether the sidewalks are plowed, safety, food access, transportation, and so on. So there will be a series of publications that are coming out. The University of Minnesota Institute on Community Integration has published an issue of our impact newsletter on this conference that's available now at ici.umn.edu, which is what you're seeing on your screen. Other resources that we have available through the University of Minnesota include several that are developed by the RISP project. You can access all those resources at risp.umn.edu. We have infographics available that share our key findings in digestible individual bite-size graphics. And those are available to download and use in your presentations. We also have a state profile for every state that shows trends in long-term supports and services and also current status of services. We have a chart gallery where you can customize a report on whatever topic you're interested in for your state. We have a technical report that has, in all of its glorious detail, all of these detailed statistics that we keep every year. And then we have historic publications. The ACL website at acl.gov/30 years has a publication that we've prepared with the 2 other longitudinal projects of national significance on 30 years of community living. And I'd encourage you to go there and check that out if you want to know more about long-term supports and services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We also have at ici.umn.edu policy research briefs and policy forums where we talk about individual specific issues. We had one forum this fall that talked about the possibility that we could be without state-operated, state-run institutions in the next several years if the current trends continue. And we had another one that focused on an increase in the movement between the remaining state-run institutions and criminal justice system. There's a lot more people moving back and forth between those settings. And so we had a conversation about that. And then finally, we partner with the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services to share data bites. And one of our plans as a research and trending center, as RISP, is to post those data bites onto our website as well. So you can look for some additional information coming soon. Next slide, please. I just want to acknowledge that the RISP project is a team effort. As I said, we partner with NASDs and Mary Sauer, but we also have I work with a number of people at the University of Minnesota, each of whom bring their gifts and talents to making possible the information that we shared with you today. With that, I will thank you, and we will turn to questions.
Well, thank you, Sherry. The data really shows where people with IDDD are residing, and we really appreciate you giving us an overview of that. And while it's promising that the number of people living in their own homes is increasing, and that the number of people living in institutions is decreasing, I think the data still brings home the limited housing options for people with IDDD, and really the need to do more to increase the number of people who are residing in a home of their choosing. I'd like to really thank all of our speakers today. I think each of them could have taken up the full hour that we had to speak. And there's a lot to share, but they, I think, all did a great job of highlighting both the challenges and some of the innovation that's happening, and also the advocacy that's happening to ensure that people with IDDD are living in the community. We'd like to open it now for questions, and I've been watching the chat box and seeing questions that have been posted there. So we will start there. I did just want to mention that we are time limited. We are the webinar ends at 4:15, so we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. I'd also like to remind you that the webinar, the PowerPoint, is going to be posted on the HSRC website. And that will also have the resources that we've posted in the chat available on the website as well. So we'll turn now to the questions that are in the chat. And I think actually the first one was more of a comment about an individual who has a close friend who had an intellectual disability and epilepsy, and spent years trying to get housing for his friend or her friend. And the difficulty in the advocacy, I think that's what Teresa spoke to, and getting his wants and needs for housing, and that it was never a priority for those who are supporting him. And then his family lost their house, and he called in a crisis. And unfortunately, on the story that's been relayed here, this individual passed away from a seizure in his sleep. And not only is that upsetting to this individual who posted in the chat box, but I think that is something that we're collectively all very disturbed by. But it's also unfortunately what we're seeing happen to many people who aren't able to get safe, affordable, and accessible housing, and why it is so important that we collectively are addressing this issue, and hope that the information today has been helpful, and that our webinars to come will also be helpful in hopefully ending these kinds of situations and avoiding them altogether. The next question is about the laws regarding protections for those entering the hospital and rehab and keeping their home while getting care. So I want to see if any of our panelists want to take that question.
No, I'm hoping one of your resource center people might be able to answer that. I know that Medicaid has rules about how many days you can be gone from a Medicaid funded facility before your spot would be given to someone else, but I don't know about housing in general and about hospitals and rehab.
I know Mary had to leave at 4, so she won't be able to answer that question. And Teresa, I don't know if you have any insights in that. I would just add that I would imagine what's allowable in the different states and local communities is going to vary for the reasons that both Sherry and Mary talked about. It does, I think this is going to vary based on what the local and state requirements are. But again, Teresa, do you have any insights on that?
It does vary from state to state how flexible it is and how providers react to this opportunity to sometimes move people along the system because they are difficult to find staff for. And it is with great sadness, I say that it varies so much that people just can't even keep up with it most of the time. But we have our advocates and our our disability resources to support people to find out and ask these questions before hopefully it happens to you. You can talk with your family. Please don't let them do this to me. If they do this, please help me to get back to my place so that families know what your expectations are if you do have a hospitalization or an extended rehab stay, so that they know how to fight for what you want. That's most of it is the advocacy part and talking to the protection and advocacy organizations in your state to help you when those rights are being violated.
And I just think that's another example of how housing can be fragile and threatened for people with disabilities, including IDD, and that if you have to go into a rehab facility, if there's been some kind of health situation or some other event, that it is a threat to your living situation, which is clearly a problem. The next one is more of a comment, and it's to you, Teresa, in terms of the story that you shared, and that it's very painful and disgusting to hear your story in 2023 regarding your home. And I think that's speaking to the fragility of your housing, given the current circumstances, and that case managers or service providers have a major responsibility to serve as each other's advocate and to assure informed choice in housing, employment, and integrated community life. Supported living is now just evidence-based best practice for all persons with developmental disabilities, regardless of significance of support needs. Group homes do not get the same quality of life outcomes. Yes, we need to address the workforce issues with increased wages and required certification of competencies through either the National Alliance of Direct Support Professionals or the College of Direct Support, and then expect outcomes consistent with improved quality of life and the HCBS settings rule based on the ADA and the Olmsted Supreme Court decision of 1999. Teresa, did you want to respond to that in any way?
Well, thank you again for, excuse me, for reminding us of all of the great advocacy that has come before. We need to make sure that self-advocates know this information because they don't know how hard people have fought if they're new to advocacy and have not experienced this. And to also let families know that there have been people who've come before you who have fought for these rights, and you have that same right for you and your family and your child to have that expectation that they should be in the least restrictive environment that is available, and that you have a say in what happens.
The next question, and there's a number of questions about sharing the slides and the PowerPoint, so I think we've addressed those questions and they will be available on the HSRC website. There's a question about, is there funding to support home condo ownership to allow adults with IDD to have permanent housing? So I don't know, Sherry and Teresa, if you want to address this specifically. I do think that, and there was a response to that question in the chat box. I think this is going to vary in terms of what states and local communities might be doing and offering, and the innovative ways in which they might be partnering with resources like that are offered through HUD. And again, we'll be getting into more of these innovative ways in which people are leveraging funding to support home ownership for people with IDDD in our subsequent webinars. But just quickly, Teresa and Sherry, do you have anything that you'd want to add there?
No, I just know it can be done because I had friends with intellectual and developmental disabilities successfully become homeowners despite having very, very limited incomes. So there are mechanisms and tools, and I'm hoping that the Resource Center and all the resources that they've posted in the webinar chat are going to address those issues.
Thanks. I think the next question is to you, Sherry, about getting the figure of how many people simply deceased among the rest of those settings that were covered in the last slide. I also cover folks who are not receiving support through any disability silos. So I don't know if that's available.
So two-part answer to your question. First of all, do we have information about people who are not receiving services through state IDD systems? Our information about that group of people is very limited. ACL has been committed over the last many, many years to improving information about people in the general population who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, and there have been extensive work has been done to improve the quality of or not the quality, but improve access to state national representative surveys that would allow us to answer your question. But as of today, I don't have an answer to that question. Can we figure out how many of the people who died versus the number of people who left nursing home settings? That information came from the Casper data system, and we will continue to analyze that data, but I don't have an answer today, and I wouldn't want to go any farther in speculating until I've had a chance to look very carefully at the information.
All right, thank you. And then there's another question about just wanting access to the report. And again, I think we've got links now to that. A question about whether the U.S. territories are included in the data, Sherry.
It's a great question, and ACL asked the projects of national significance to look specifically at whether we would be able to provide data like we do for the 50 states and the District of Columbia for the U.S. territories. We did a special study on that a few years ago, and basically what we found is that the systems for services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the territories are much different than the ones in the United States, mostly because Medicaid in the territories is a Black granted program, and so it must meet all of the medical and health needs of all of the citizens of the territories, and very little resource goes to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so the short answer is no, we don't have data on U.S. territories.
I think the next question, I don't think it's a question. I think it may be just referencing that protection and advocacy agencies are viable resources on disability rights. So I'm hoping I'm understanding that comment or question correctly. And then there's a question on, is there a specific percentage of households in a designated neighborhood that can be supported with HCBS services? I know developers who might set aside 25% or so of their developments for people with IDD, but have been discouraged by the state quoting congregate rules. We can't get an information on what is allowed. My son doesn't want congregate housing. He just wants peers who live down the street. So I know that there are entities that are working on these kinds of issues and finding solutions around that. And again, we're going to be highlighting more of those in our subsequent webinars. So I hope you can join us for those. But Sherry and Teresa, is there anything that you would want to add to that?
So I think that this person is referring to proposed or existing intentional communities where there are groups of people with intellectual or developmental disabilities that live in close proximity to one another, and the HCBS, the rule really is what comes out of the home and Medicaid home and community-based services rule. And so Medicaid would have to answer that question for you. But the sense of that rule is that the goal is to use home and community-based services money to support people in inclusive communities. And so the kind of the way that states have been instructed to think about these things is to look to see if people are able to live next to people without disabilities and to experience their communities in the same way that people without disabilities can.
I was just going to agree with that, Sherry, that self-advocates look at it as a way of, are we still locking people away if they live in gated communities and isolating them from their community where they have to have codes and things that they have to remember to be able to leave? And self-advocates are very concerned, but I know for family members, sometimes they believe that is the best option. And so it would be a discussion that you would need to have with your adult child that is asking, why do I live in a gated community, and having them understand what the access is and how to get out of that community when they want to.
And I see that we're at the end of our time and actually 1 minute over. So we're going to bring our webinar to a close. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I again want to thank our speakers. As I mentioned, we're going to have 2 additional webinars that will highlight ways in which states and local communities are finding options and solutions to creating more community living options for people with IDDD. So we encourage you to watch out for those announcements in those states that will announce the webinars that we'll be having in the future. But again, thank you and have a great day.